Welcome back to the Crusty Critics and the podcast where we tell you what we really think. I'm Margaret Caldwell, and we are thrilled to have you with us today.
Harold Whitmore. Some know me as the Footnote. Most know me as the one who's right. I'm delighted to be here, even if today's selection required me to operate somewhat outside my usual literary comfort zone.
Frank Doyle. Frank to people I actually like. Let's get into it.
Today we are discussing Reminders of Him by Colleen Hoover, published in 2022. For those who don't know her, and by now that's a very short list, Colleen Hoover is one of the best-selling novelists in the world, with a massive and devoted readership largely built through social media. Reminders of Him is a contemporary romance with considerable emotional weight. It follows Kenna Rowan, a young woman who returns to the small town where her daughter lives after serving a 5-year prison sentence. She was convicted in connection with the death of her boyfriend, Scotty, and must now navigate a community that despises her, including Scotty's parents, who are raising her daughter, Deem, and Ledger Ward, Scotty's best friend. Frank, I know you have things to say.
I always have things to say. Whether they'll align with the majority opinion on this particular book is a separate question.
The majority opinion on this book is extremely enthusiastic. Millions of readers, tears on every review. The book talk phenomenon has been extensively documented. We are perhaps not the majority.
Let's start with what the book is actually doing beneath the romance.
All right. Reminders of Him. What it's about. A woman gets out of prison for a conviction related to the night her boyfriend died. She left him at the scene of a car accident, believing he was already dead. He wasn't. She pleaded guilty. Did 5 years. Now she's back in the town where his parents are raising their daughter, and she wants to know her child. And somewhere along the way, she and the dead boyfriend's best friend fall for each other. That's the book.
That is the plot. The themes are a great deal richer. At its core, this is a novel about the possibility of redemption. Not in a spiritual sense, but in an acutely social one. Can a community that has assigned you the role of villain ever allow you to become something else? Hoover is interrogating the question of whether forgiveness is a right, a gift, or something that has to be earned. And crucially, she asks, who gets to decide?
And she answers it beautifully, I think, through the Landry family. Patrick and Grace are not cartoonish antagonists. They are grieving parents who have built their lives around the daughter of the son they lost.
Right.
And who are being asked to share that daughter with the woman they hold responsible for his death. The novel doesn't ask us to think they're wrong. It asks us to understand that grief and forgiveness can coexist.
That's the book's strongest thematic move. It doesn't make Kenna the victim of a cruel, unreasonable family. It makes the Landrys sympathetic and their pain entirely legitimate.
Exactly.
When Patrick finally snaps and hits Ledger, you understand it. You might even feel it's deserved. That moral complexity is real, and Hoover earns it.
There is also the secondary theme of maternal identity, what it means to be a mother who has never mothered. Kenna's chapters are saturated with this ache. She has written letters to Scotty for 5 years, not just about their relationship, but documenting everything she can remember about him so that DM will someday know who her father was. It's an act of love toward both of them, and it reframes Kenna from passive victim to active participant in her daughter's life, even in absence.
The letters are one of the novel's great structural choices. They give us Kenna's interiority in a form that feels earned and private. She's not narrating to us. She's talking to Scotty. And through that we get not just her pain, but her humor, her warmth, the rubber hand story, the ring story, all the details of who she was when she was loved. It's a masterful device.
The rubber hands. 10 tiny rubber hands, one for each finger, bought for $2 instead of the $4,000 ring he couldn't afford. I'll admit it, that detail got me.
As well it should. It is doing enormous thematic work. It establishes Scotty's character, playful, financially realistic, emotionally present, and it establishes the quality of their relationship.
Exactly.
He couldn't give her the ring. He gave her 10 rubber hands and kissed each palm. That's a man worth grieving. That's a man worth the entire plot.
Let's talk character, because Kenna Rowan is the make-or-break proposition of this entire novel. Everything depends on whether you believe in her.
And I do. Which surprised me, frankly, because the setup invites skepticism. A woman who left the scene of an accident and served prison time. We are asked to sympathize with her immediately. Hoover achieves that by giving Kenna a childhood backstory that is neither melodramatic nor convenient. A neglectful mother, 2 stints in foster care, a profound hunger for the kind of family she never had. By the time she meets Scotty's parents and is nearly overwhelmed by the experience of being at a dinner table where a family actually prays together, we understand everything about what she stands to lose when Scotty dies.
Kenna's scene with her own mother in the prison visitation room is devastating. She reached out hoping for a do-over, hoping her mother might become a grandmother and finally show up for her. And her mother comes in with a smug smile and says, essentially, "Now you know how I felt." It's a brutal scene. It completely explains why Kenna is so determined to be different. She has lived the cost of an absent mother. She will not be one.
Ledger is the character I want to spend more time on because he's doing something more complicated than the romantic lead usually does. He is genuinely conflicted. He loved Scotty. He has spent 5 years hating Kenna on Scotty's behalf, and then she walks into his bar on a Friday night before he knows who she is, and something happens. And he has to live with both of those things simultaneously.
The loyalty whiplash, as he calls it, is the novel's most honest psychological observation. He feels like Kenna's monster and Deem's protector. Those two things are in direct conflict, and Hoover doesn't resolve that conflict cheaply. Ledger doesn't just decide Kenna's good and everything is fine. He wrestles, he makes mistakes. He keeps lying to Patrick and Grace even as he falls for her, and then he has to face the consequences of that.
Patrick hitting him is the right story beat. It feels earned. And Ledger not hitting back feels right too. He tells us he wouldn't defend himself because he deserved it. That's a man with a conscience. I can work with that.
Diem, can we talk about Diem, because she is the pivot point of the entire book, and Hoover writes her with tremendous care.
Yes.
She's 4 years old. She names her turtle after Ledger. She asks if Ledger is going to marry her mom about 4 minutes after meeting Kenna. She is completely unaware of her own centrality to everyone's suffering, and that unawareness is precisely what makes the meeting scene so powerful.
When Kenna finally meets Diem in the backyard, she tells her simply, "I'm your mother." And Diem's response is entirely that of a 4-year-old. She says, "Really?" and then asks if Kenna wants to see her turtle. That is perfect. Hoover resists the urge to make the reunion cinematic and tear-stained from Diem's perspective. Diem doesn't know she was missing anything, which means Kenna gets to slip into her life without a ripple. It's the kindest thing the novel does.
I want to briefly address the pigeon. At the end of the novel, Ledger and Patrick are sitting on the back porch after Kenna has been integrated into the family dinner, and a real pigeon wanders into the backyard.
Right.
Because the running joke between Scotty and Ledger since they were teenagers was this phrase, "Is that a fucking pigeon?" used whenever something didn't make sense. It's the first time Patrick laughs at a Scotty memory without crying afterward. I don't care how sentimental it is. It worked on me.
It is Chekhov's pigeon, introduced early in Kenna's letters, paid off magnificently at the end. That's craft.
Let's talk about how Hoover writes, because I think this is where the critical establishment and the reading public tend to diverge most sharply, and I want to give it a fair hearing.
Hoover's prose is functional. It is not literary in the elevated sense. It prioritizes clarity, velocity, and emotional directness over complexity of sentence structure or poetic imagery. Her chapters are short. Her dialogue is contemporary and naturalistic. She does not linger on description. What she does do extraordinarily well is emotional interiority. You always know precisely what a character is feeling and why. The inner life of her protagonist is rendered with remarkable precision.
She also knows how to plant a detail and pay it off. The rubber hands, the ring, the pigeon, the letters, the scrunchie Kenna takes from Ledger's truck because it has a strand of Diem's hair on it. The scrunchie Kenna wears in her own hair for the rest of her shift at the grocery store. Hoover understands that the small, specific object carries more emotional weight than the grand statement. That's not an accident. That's instinct.
The dual point of view is essential to the book's architecture. We get alternating chapters from Kenna and Ledger, and Hoover is disciplined about what each of them knows and doesn't know.
Exactly.
When Ledger reads the first line of one of Kenna's letters in her tote bag at the grocery store break room, just the opening, "Dear Scotty," and then closes the bag out of respect for her privacy, that moment tells us everything about who he is. He could have read further. He chose not to.
The alternating POV also creates dramatic irony in a way that Hoover exploits with considerable skill. We know things about Kenna that Ledger doesn't. We know things about Ledger's inner conflict that Kenna can only guess at. The gap between what we know and what the characters know generates genuine tension without relying on contrivance.
I'll say this about the style. It's not the prose I would call great literature, but it is the prose of someone who understands storytelling. Those are not the same thing, and conflating them is a mistake critics often make.
Right.
Hoover is a storyteller in the oldest sense. She knows how to make you need to know what happens next, and she knows how to make you care about the people it's happening to.
Did this book make you feel something? I'll go first. Yes. The scene where Kenna describes giving birth prematurely in prison, being taken to the hospital under armed guard, and then being sent back without ever holding her daughter, never even getting to look into Diem's eyes, and I found genuinely difficult to read. Not difficult as in poorly written, difficult as in I had to put it down.
The prison birth sequence is the emotional center of the novel. Everything radiates outward from that scene.
Exactly.
When Kenna tells Ledger, sitting in the grass on the side of the road, that she had 2 days of hospital recovery time after the birth, alone with an armed guard, and that they sent her back to prison before she ever held Diem, Ledger's response is simply her name. He can't say anything else. And Kenna says, "Don't. Whatever you're about to say, don't." That is a woman who has heard enough inadequate responses to her pain.
I'll acknowledge the emotional impact, particularly the Ledger chapters, because you don't expect to be moved by the guy who spends the first half of the book being a reasonable obstacle. But the scene where he's building the swing set with Patrick, and Patrick starts crying while laughing about the pigeon joke, and Ledger just quietly leaves to give him privacy. That hit me, because Ledger's grief is the unspoken grief in this book. He lost his best friend. He doesn't get the same room as the parents to fall apart.
The moment where Grace brushes a strand of hair out of Kenna's face after years of hatred and grief and blame. Grace says, "We go forward. That's it. I forgive you, and you forgive me, and we go forward together." And she brushes that hair back behind Kenna's ear, like a mother would. I don't think Colleen Hoover is trying to write Dostoevsky, but I think she is trying to write something true about how forgiveness actually works, not as a legal declaration, but as a small physical gesture. That moment is earned.
And the fact that Kenna's internal monologue at that moment turns to, "You're forgiven, Kenna." She is not only receiving Grace's forgiveness, she is finally extending it to herself after 5 years, after therapy, after letters she could never send. The moment she forgives herself is the novel's emotional climax, and it arrives quietly with lasagna in the background. That's a choice. That's very good storytelling.
Fine, I cried, briefly, during the swing set chapter. Now let's move on.
Structure. The novel alternates between Kenna and Ledger, with Kenna's letters to Scotty interspersed as a third register. It is a tight, efficiently plotted book. Hoover does not waste pages. The chapters are short, rarely more than a few thousand words, and each one either advances the emotional situation or delivers a piece of character backstory that recontextualizes what we already know.
The pacing is aggressive. I mean that as a compliment. This is a book that does not sag in the middle, and that is rarer than it should be. Every time the tension between Kenna and the Landrys seems to reach a standstill, Hoover engineers a new collision. The grocery store parking lot sequence, where Kenna sees DM for the first time and Grace speeds away, with Kenna actually touching the back of the car before it drives off, is a perfectly constructed scene of agonizing near miss.
The novel is also well structured in how it withholds information. We don't get the full account of what happened the night Scotty died until well into the book. Hoover parses it out strategically.
Right.
We get pieces of it in Kenna's letters, pieces of it in Ledger's memories, and the full picture only assembles gradually. That structure keeps the reader calibrating their sympathy across the whole novel.
My one structural critique is the restraining order subplot. It is introduced and then somewhat anticlimactically resolved when the Landry's lawyer clarifies there is nothing Kenna can legally do. This felt like a device that was installed to create threat but never fully deployed. The real tension was always emotional, not legal, and I think the legal element occasionally muddied the more interesting question.
Agreed. The book is strongest when it's about what people choose to do with their grief and their anger. The legal mechanics are the least interesting version of that conflict.
Discussability. Because our listeners are here partly to decide what to bring to their book clubs, and I think this is a book that deserves honest attention on that front.
It is extraordinarily discussable, but the discussion will require some intellectual honesty about the genre. If a group enters Reminders of Him looking to treat it as literary fiction, they will miss what is actually interesting about it. If they approach it as popular fiction executed with genuine emotional intelligence, the conversation will be rich. The distinction matters.
The questions it generates are the best kind, the ones without clean answers. Was Kenna's guilty plea the right choice or an act of self-punishment? Were the Landrys wrong to keep DM from her mother for the first 5 years? Is there a version of Patrick and Grace's grief that justifies what they did to Kenna? And perhaps most interestingly, does Scotty's absence make him easier or harder to judge? He is the most important character in the book, and we never meet him in the present.
Scotty is a fascinating construction. We only know him through Kenna's love and Ledger's friendship and his parents' grief. He is built entirely from the impression he left on other people. And yet by the end of the novel, I felt I knew him. The pigeon joke, the rubber hands, the moment in his parents' driveway when he told Kenna he'd give her a house where she could lock the door and only let the people in she wanted. That's a character, built entirely in negative space.
There is also a powerful conversation to be had about what the novel says about the American criminal justice system and its relationship to motherhood. Kenna's guilt is not in dispute. She did something wrong. But the consequence, giving birth in prison, never holding her newborn, having her parental rights nearly terminated, is a consequence that falls on the child too. DM paid for a crime she had nothing to do with. That is a conversation worth having.
And for the book club that includes people who love the romance and people who are skeptical of it, which describes most book clubs in my experience, there's room here for both. The skeptics will find real thematic substance. The romantics will find a love story that earns its tenderness. That's a book worth reading together.
I want to add one thing. The scene where Lady Diana, the teenager from Kenna's apartment building, sees Ledger in the break room and calls him a jerk. She calls him that every single time she sees him through the entire novel, on Kenna's behalf. It's the most consistent and satisfying running joke in the book. A good book club will appreciate Lady Diana.
Lady Diana is the moral compass of the novel, and she is 15.
Final verdicts. Harold, you have the floor.
Reminders of Him is not the book I expected it to be, and I mean that entirely as a compliment. Hoover has been dismissed by certain corners of the literary world as purely commercial, and this book directly refutes that dismissal. The thematic architecture is real. The emotional intelligence is genuine. The dual POV is disciplined and effective. The letters are structurally brilliant. Is the prose elevated? No. Does it need to be? Emphatically, no. This is a book that understands what it is and executes it with considerable skill. 4 out of 5. I came in skeptical and I leave with respect.
I'm going to say something that might surprise our listeners. This is a better book than it has any right to be, given the premise. The emotional manipulation I expected is largely absent. Hoover works for her tears. She builds genuine human beings and then puts them in genuinely impossible situations, and she doesn't resolve those situations cleanly or cheaply. The pigeon at the end is the only moment that felt slightly too convenient, and even then, I couldn't argue it didn't work. 3.5, rounded up to 4. The Kenna in Prison Birth chapter alone is worth the cover price.
For me, Reminders of Him is a book that earns the emotion it asks for. It doesn't manipulate. It builds. It constructs fully human characters on all sides of a genuinely painful situation and asks, what does forgiveness cost? Who pays for it? And what is possible on the other side of it? The answers it arrives at are not easy and not cheap. The novel ends with a pigeon, a 4-year-old naming her turtle after Ledger, and a family sitting down to lasagna. And somehow, after everything that comes before it, that is enough. That is more than enough. 5 out of 5. And that is a wrap on Reminders of Him by Colleen Hoover. I think it's safe to say this one moved all of us, even the ones who arrived with their defenses firmly in place.
I arrived with defenses. I will not claim they were entirely effective.
I arrived with footnotes prepared for every expected flaw and found myself having to retire most of them. That is not a complaint. That is, I believe, what good books are supposed to do.
To our listeners, thank you as always for spending this hour with us. We know you have no shortage of places to take your reading time, and we are grateful every single week that you bring it here.
If Reminders of Him has found its way onto your to-read list, we encourage you to let it do what it intends to do. Don't rush it. Sit with Kenna's letters, let the rubber hands land, give the pigeon its due, and if you bring it to your book club, come back and tell us how the room divided. We suspect it will. Beautifully.
Next episode. Something with fewer emotions and more structural architecture. That's my preference. Whether it's granted is another question entirely. Until then.
So until then, keep reading, keep feeling things, even when it's inconvenient, especially then.
This has been the Crusty Critics. I'm Harold Whitmore. The footnotes are always where the truth lives.
Frank Doyle. Buck to those I like. Read more. Expect more.
Margaret Caldwell. See you next episode.